Howdy, welcome to Coach Clucker's Classroom. Today we're going to be talking about Vietnam, specifically the Vietnam War. So the road to Vietnam dates all the way back to World War II, with the expansion of Soviets growing and wanting to spread the communist ideology. The U.S. is going to have to take on a policy of containment. Now, this would mean that President Truman, in order to stop Soviet expansion into regions like the Dardanelles, Turkey, and Greece, controlling the Straits of Bosphorus into the Black Sea, Truman is passing the idea of the Truman Doctrine. Any country that wants to resist the spread of communism can ask the U.S. for aid, and the U.S. will send money, weapons, and even people to go fight and die to stop the spread of communism. The first example of this is the Korean War. As we've already talked about in our Cold War video, the North will invade the South will fight back with the help of the U.S. and the United Nations Security Council, sending troops. The war will struggle on for 3 years, but the border will eventually be set at the 38th parallel on the modern-day DMZ. This is the theory of the domino effect, or the domino theory. The idea if one country fell underneath the communist influence, others would follow. And so the country that is going to become the next domino after Korea is going to be Vietnam. Now, the Vietnamese will fight against the Japanese, they'll fight against the French, they'll fight against the U.S., all backed by the Chinese, dating before World War II. And so Ho Chi Minh leading the communists and the push, the U.S. will offer to help France, but only if they give Vietnam its own independence. And so in 1956, with elections in the North and the South is divided and created as a anti-communist, while the North is a pro-communist government. The U.S. is going to pour aid into South Vietnam to help Diem, but he is going to be fighting a guerrilla revolt from the communists in southern Vietnam. When Kennedy gets into office, he is going to take a more aggressive stance. He's going to send military troops and advisors to South Vietnam to train them in American technology, American equipment. And as Diem gets more and more unpopular, JFK will work with his generals and assassinate Diem to put in new leadership. 3 weeks after Diem is assassinated, Kennedy will be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Shortly after the assassination of Kennedy in 1864, the USS Maddox is on a patrol route in the Gulf of Tonkin, the coast off of Vietnam. It'll come under fire from a North Vietnamese ship. President Johnson is going to see this not only as an attack on South Vietnam, but also as an official attack on the United States. And so President Johnson is going to ask the government for a declaration of war or an authorization to use force to protect the American soldiers in Vietnam. This is what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gives the U.S. and the president a police power to repel any attack on U.S. forces or any threats to U.S. forces. And it gives the president pretty much the ability to conduct a war without officially declaring war on a nation. So Kennedy is going to take a more aggressive stance than JFK when it comes to Vietnam, launching many missions like Operation Rolling Thunder, where we carpet bomb large cities and strips of North Vietnam, wanting to destroy communist bases and facilities. The North is never going to sue for peace, and so the U.S. will become more committed and send more troops as violence and combat become more and more relevant. Between 1865 and 73, the U.S. is going to drop over 6 million tons of bombs in North Vietnam. We have the creation of napalm, which is like a jelly gasoline, kind of like what they would put in a flamethrower to get the flame to stick to anything it ever came in contact with, and continues to burn even if it was to be sprayed with, let's say, a fire extinguisher. There's no way to put it out until it completely burns through several hours later. The U.S. will also use chemical weapons like Agent Orange to kill plant life since it is a jungle. We will spray this across the forest to kill trees, grass, any animals that eat it. Water will become contaminated and cause birth defects in children if their mothers drink it while pregnant or come in contact with it. And so the U.S. is having to change its ways of war during Vietnam. The North Vietnamese not able to take on the U.S. on a large scale head on because the U.S. would have an advantage. They're going to operate in hit and run methods. With Vietnam being a forest, a very thick rainforest, the idea of moving trucks through Vietnam is not quick, and it's also very difficult to do in a forest with lots of rivers and mountains. And so we have the first large-scale use of the helicopter, being able to take troops up in the air and transport them to areas where they are needed. By the end of 1865, the U.S. is going to have over 30,000 men killed in Vietnam, and the resentment of the war will continue to grow. Part of this is because in the United States at this time, the 26th Amendment had not been passed, and so young men are being drafted in the Selective Service Act, but can't vote for anyone in office until they turn 21. And so, since no one's volunteering, the draft is instated, men are being pulled in. The only way to get out is if you are enrolled in college. There is the harsh reality that you can be drafted to fight and die for your country, but can't have a say in who's sending you there. So, of the millions of veterans that will serve in Vietnam, most are going to come from poor and working class backgrounds. Many of them are unable to enroll in college to get out of the war. Many of them feel they have a civic duty to fight when the U.S. calls them. But as casualties mount, people are going to become more and more resentful of the war. College enrollment will double. Young men will burn their draft cards, flee to Canada, flee when they are listed as being drafted, and try to all methods of not serving in the war. Now, the average person who died in Vietnam, the average American who died in Vietnam, was about 19 years old. So this is a young person's war. Those getting out of high school are eligible for draft. Everyone who is a young male is eligible for a draft at this time. And so we see the protests against the Vietnam War not just being at college campuses, but also in high schools. Students in Des Moines, Iowa, will wear a black armband with a peace symbol on it to protest the Vietnam War. This case is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and so the Supreme Court will rule that wearing a armband was a freedom of expression, and free speech is not only in spoken words. There's other ways you can express yourself. So with the counter push against the Vietnam War and the draft, We also have counterculture developing in the 60s. People rejecting the values and behaviors of their parents, the rejection of respectable norms in clothing, language, sexual behavior, and drug use. A prime example of this is the creation and performance of Woodstock. Some 400,000 people will go to New York to watch a concert, engage in drugs and other various forms of narcotics, dangerous sexual activities, music, alcohol. But all of the counterculture is coming because for the first time ever, America puts journalists into combat roles. So now, for the first time ever, day in and day out, Americans are seeing the first-hand brutal accounts of the Vietnam War, many times without context. There are two photos on the screen. The top one is of a photo of a young child who had died during a Viet Cong bombing in South Vietnam. The bottom photo is showing a man about to be executed. The man in the plaid on the right was convicted of breaking into a colonel's house, killing the colonel, his wife, and his 8 children by beheading all of them. And so when he is caught, he is dragged out into the streets and shot. And this is televised on live TV. We also get a credibility gap because President Johnson is telling Americans they're winning the war. We are doing great things in Vietnam, but the only things being shown on TV is the death, the destruction, and the loss of life and honor in Vietnam. And so in 1968, we've been in Vietnam for a while at this point in time. Over the holiday of Tet, which is the equivalent of New Year's in Vietnam, there was supposed to be a ceasefire during the New Year. However, over the New Year, there were a major coordinated attack on the eve on 41 major cities, including the American Embassy in Saigon. While the U.S. ultimately comes out victorious, it is not a victory without heavy, heavy losses. So after the Tet Offense, General Westmoreland in Vietnam is going to ask for more troops. The U.S. is going to start looking at Vietnam and think that more troops means more taxes and more money, more draft call-ups, more people are going to become upset and protest, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to win the war. And so we shift from this idea of trying to be victorious in Vietnam and defeating the communists to settling for peace. So with the war going on and it going bad, President Johnson is going to announce he is not going to run for re-election. He's not going to run. So the Democrats will choose Robert Kennedy, and the Republicans are going to choose Richard Nixon from California. Nixon is going to argue that he is representing the silent majority, who were Americans who were not demonstrating, and most Americans were trying to live the dream, American dream, work hard, have a family, and provide a better life for their children than protesting against the war. And so during the presidential campaign, Robert Kennedy is going to be assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan, and they'll be replaced by Hubert Humphrey. And this is going to be a drastic shift in not necessarily the outcomes of the American history, but of the election. Because if you have a presidential candidate who is killed in the middle of an election, you now have half the time to get someone else who's just as popular and has been leading the nation, or that you would want to lead the nation. And so when Nixon gets into office, he knows that he is going to have to end the war. And we have the Treaty of Paris, which is an attempt to end the war. And it is an interesting moment, the Treaty of Paris, because when we go to Paris, we rent out an entire 5-star hotel for all the diplomats and politicians to try and negotiate the peace treaty for settling in Vietnam. The Vietnamese delegation that went to Paris bought a house. Bought a house to own it and keep it as their property. Because they knew that it was going to take longer. And the longer they waited, the more the US was going to try and settle on a peace in Vietnam. And so as the peace treaties continue, Nixon is going to expand the war into Cambodia and Laos, and college students across the U.S. are going to protest. One in particular is Kent State University in Ohio. As the protests will continue, the National Guard will be called in, and as a soldier believes he is going to be shot at, he will fire his rifle into the crowd, and the soldiers next to him will follow suit, thinking that they are under fire. At the end of the day, 4 college students are going to have been killed by the National Guard, and it's going to help turn public opinion of the war. Another event that's going to change the opinion of the war is the My Lai massacre. Now, it comes out in 1971 that this happened, but it doesn't. But it happened 3 years before. So it came out. This event happened in 1968, and it took 3 years for word to spread. And so Lieutenant Calley is going to have his platoon go into a village, and he's going to order them to wax the village and kill all 500 civilians that are there, because they believe some of them are posing as Viet Cong communist rebels. Not all the soldiers are going to follow orders in killing off the civilians, but most will, and so 500 civilians will be killed, and the effect of this is when it gets out in the US, it's a massive reputation. It hits and does massive damage to the US reputation and the credibility of the armed forces. And so, again, with the My Lai massacre and the Tet Offense and the Paris talks all going awry, Nixon is going to try and block a lot of this coming to light. The Pentagon Papers, the reporting of the My Lai massacre will come out and help try and censor this. The Supreme Court will rule in favor of New York Times. And so it shows that American leaders are trying to cover up some of the atrocities that are going on, and helps build the distrust between American citizens and their politicians. And so this idea of Nixon with the treaty going awry, he knew from day one he was going to try and end the war. And so he calls this plan Vietnamization. The idea that the U.S. would gradually withdraw from Vietnam, shifting control over to South Vietnam. The idea that if we just gave him equipment, South Vietnam will eventually be able to control and win on their own. We continue to have massive air raids in Vietnam. And this is actually the same strategy that the United States uses in Afghanistan. And it's the same strategy the Russians use. The Russians use in Afghanistan as well. And so we have a double standard of we don't like to recognize us losing Vietnam because we don't consider ourselves losing in Iraq or Afghanistan, but we have the same operation. Now, with American troops withdrawing from the U.S., from the U.S. withdrawing from North Vietnam and the treaty becoming more and more real that peace might actually happen in North Vietnam and South Vietnam, they re-elect Nixon over an anti-war president. So the U.S. signs the peace treaty, and the U.S. starts withdrawing its troops. POWs are exchanged. South Vietnam's government would remain in power, being a non-communist government. And the U.S. and Vietnam agree on peace. Nixon calls this a peace with honor. So American soldiers are going to return home and find a more divided America than when they left. Over 2.5 million Americans are going to serve in the war, but unlike World War I and World War II, when soldiers come home, they are unappreciated. They're going to be labeled as baby killers. And it's going to be the only war or conflict that the U.S. would lose. Vietnam was a political, social, and military disaster on the U.S. side. But as it goes in every war, we have those who answer when duty calls. One of them being Sergeant Roy Benavidez. He will save the lives of 8 soldiers and receive the Medal of Honor. We will also erect the Vietnam Wall, the War Memorial in Washington, D.C., to remember those who lost their lives during the Vietnam War. With the U.S. officially out and the war over, for Vietnam, the ceasefire was never honored. It was in 1975, shortly after the peace treaty, that the North launched a massive scale attack on the South. And without American support, South Vietnam was going to lose, and the communists would claim the capital of Saigon. So, after almost 20 years of fighting and millions of deaths, Vietnam is going to become a communist nation and be unified under the communist flag. So the Vietnamese becoming communism and the domino theory is shown here as communism spreads into Laos and Cambodia. in Cambodia. There are anyone who is having ties to the anti-communist government or efforts is going to be executed or die in a labor camp. And over 3 million people are going to be killed in Cambodia resisting communism. So, with the American War being a disaster, Congress passed the War Powers Act, limiting the control of the president from the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gave the president the power to wage a war for effectively 48 hours without consulting with Congress. And so this is designed so the president does not remain in another long drawn out war like we had stayed in Vietnam. So what does this do to the U.S. economy? Quite a bit. We spend almost $1 trillion fighting in Vietnam. We've spent almost $300 billion in veterans benefits. The war led to more debt for most Americans. Inflation greatly increased. The 1970s economy was unreliable with high unemployment rates for everyone, and a lot of that being caused by the Vietnam War. So come back next time when we discuss the 1970s and the effects of U.S. culture during the 70s. Thanks for stopping by Coach K's classroom. Until next time, I love you and I'm proud of you.